Hello, everyone. This is Nevin Gussack, your host of the Patriotic Populist. And today we're going to talk about our stance on various issues. We're going to pick up from last night's episode of this program. I'm going to be elaborating on a variety of issues and what our stances are. I'm going to be speaking primarily for myself. I know Herschel would agree with me on most of these issues, probably not all of them, but most of them, given that we're very close. We've had many political conversations offline and have talked about a variety of different issues. And he has educated me, and I'm sure I've educated him. So I'm just going to give you at least my positions on a variety of issues that I think will reflect with most of the program's ideology and stances. The first thing I want to go over is political reforms. Herschel really covered that pretty well. All of his points I agreed with. We have to start out with campaign finance reform, and obviously I would continue to keep the campaign limits to about, I think it's about $2,500. I would keep it at that. I would also take a look at and examine the costs involved with public or full or partial public funding of elections. That will disincentivize the big money donors from trying to influence the votes and the policy positions of various candidates for office, federal, state, and local. This way, these candidates can truly exercise independent judgment. They can listen to all their constituents, rich, poor, middle class, whatever race or gender or occupation. And these individuals, these different interest groups, diverse American citizens can, and business leaders, labor leaders, and whatnot, they can go into the candidate's office or the elected official's office and argue the merits of their particular, policies that they want to push for. So I think campaign finance reform really will secure the independent judgment of differing candidates as well as elected officials. They'll be able to make decisions in a much more informed and impartial manner. Secondly, what I would do is, obviously, I would definitely ban or continue to ban donations by foreign entities and foreign individuals into the American political process. We need to also take a look at that. We also need to take a look at anti-lobbying reform. If you work for the government, from the janitor all the way to an ex-president, to an ex-cabinet member, ex-congressman, an ex-ambassador, an ex-military officer, an anything, bureaucrat, once you leave your job or once you leave office or retire, you are automatically subjected to a lifetime ban from lobbying. You cannot lobby for anybody. Furthermore, Americans under a patriotic populist government, Americans will also be forbidden to lobby on behalf of foreign countries, foreign governments, as well as foreign corporations. That's going to be very quickly passed. If a foreign country or a foreign corporation wants to negotiate, they could send their own representatives, diplomats, trade missions, business delegations, etc., and meet and discuss and talk with their American counterparts. Period. The end. That's a violation of the spirit of George Washington's farewell address. It's just unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable that Americans are allowed to lobby on behalf of foreign corporations and foreign governments. And let me get my handy dandy wine. I have a nice Pinot Noir red wine, chilled. So I'm just going to take a nice little drink here. Ooh, that was good. Nice. Okay. And I would also, getting back to campaign finance reform, one other thing I thought of, 24-hour disclosure of individuals who donated money to candidates, whatever the monetary amount. Another thing I would do, and this is capturing the viewpoints of people like Teddy Roosevelt, people like, in many ways, Barry Goldwater, the former conservative Republican senator, the late Congressman Walter Jones, who was one of my favorites from North Carolina. He's a Republican, but more of a sort of populist conservative Republican, a true populist conservative Republican. They all believed that labor unions and corporations should not be allowed to make donations. And I would agree with that. That's just corruption, essentially. In fact, some of the biggest actors and proponents of big money in politics, big capitalists, they refer to this, actually, the word is they say, they, quote, invest in politicians. No, big capitalist labor union leaders, they should not be, quote, investing in politicians and political candidates. Instead, they should produce their own products, they should represent the workers, and yes, they should be allowed to go to the congressmen or the senators or the presidents or various cabinet agencies and state their case if they want a policy change. But once they inject money into the political process, that compromises the independence of the legislator or government official in question. And that is wrong. We need to start from scratch in that respect. We also have to take a look, moving forward on the issue of political reform, in the spirit of George Washington, in the spirit of his farewell address. We really need to take a look at potentially, I hate saying this, but doing away with political parties. George Washington, in his farewell address, had strong misgivings about political parties that would create excessive factionalism. And we need to take a serious look at that and see if that's feasible. We can have different political clubs on the ground, and they can go and approach the legislators, whether it's a libertarian or a socialist group or a conservative or a liberal group, and state their case to the elected officials. And the elected officials will decide, based on the merits of the argument, whether they would pursue their policy suggestions or not. So, but getting back in question, when it comes to political parties, I mean, we've seen this in the past, really starting in the 1980s in my lifetime, and probably since 2010, things have been absolutely out of control with the hyperpartisanship. There are areas where Republicans and Democrats should be able to work with each other on issues related to, with policies that would actually work for the betterment of the American people. And whatever bipartisanship we do have is more often than not with screwing the American people. For example, with President Obama pushing for the 3 free trade agreements with South Korea, Colombia, and Panama. And you had a lot of Tea Party Republicans joining hands with the administration, essentially, and pushing for those policies. And those trade treaties, without going into details, you can research it, have been actually harmful to American workers. I mean, the South Korea trade agreement has actually, of course, allowed American jobs to be shed abroad or moved abroad. But I'm not going to get into that now. So again, we have to take a look at this political tribalism that has resulted from the extreme influence of political parties. They've become almost, especially in recent years, almost like cults. And I say this as a former Republican who was somewhat politically active at times. The Republican Party has become a cult. And especially with the onset of the Trump era, it's only gotten worse, not better. So again, we have to, in the spirit of George Washington, really take a look at whether we should continue to have political parties and instead have people run for office based on just their own unique ideas. In other words, everybody serving as independents, essentially, a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left, and whatnot. Which now leads me to my new point, the Constitution. I think the Constitution is definitely historically, in free or partially free countries, one of the most amazing documents. There's a lot of good in the Constitution. A lot of human rights guaranteed against, unwarranted search and seizure, that governs assembly, the right to assembly, the right to redress the grievances of your government, freedom of speech, Second Amendment, which is the preservation of firearms. And there was also ugly aspects of the Constitution, and it arose as a result of a compromise with the most reactionary, oligarchic, backward Southern plantation owners represented by this clique of senators in the southern part of the United States, which later became Dixiecrat-type leaders. We had George Washington and the other founders who were more based in the northern part of the United States. They had to reach a compromise with them, otherwise the United States, this new experiment, would collapse. So you had to develop a compromise. So the Constitution, while it is a wonderful document, but it also had its flaws. It was a product of the times. I don't believe it was this hallowed, sacred document in that respect, because it had its flaws. Again, it was a product of compromise with evil, essentially, which the slaveholding aristocracy in the South was. They were evil. There's no question about it. Let me take another sip here. But moving forward, the Constitution has been amended on issues related to taxation, to the Federal Reserve, to citizenship, to slavery, the right to women to vote, et cetera, et cetera. And we need to add some amendments and potentially add some more specific language in the Constitution. For example, something like FDR's 1944 Bill of Rights. That needs to be really examined or re-examined and potentially put into the Constitution. I strongly support that. If you want to know what they are, it is basically a social democratic set of ideas and policies, really, that would seek to enhance and strengthen free enterprise capitalism in the United States. The problem, one of the issues the Constitution does not address that is very concerning to me is the overpowering of the federal government by big capitalists, by big corporations in Wall Street. Their political allies, newspaper media organs under their control or influence, will use an originalist interpretation of the Constitution to block needed social reforms in the United States. So whenever I hear a number of conservatives and libertarians talking about liberty and freedom, I tend to say, yeah, right. What do you really mean? What they really mean is they don't want their power and profits to be interrupted or abridged. And that's where we need to take a look at the Constitution, put in the Second Bill of Rights, and we need to insert language a little bit more, perhaps in the amendments, or in perhaps elaborating a little bit in the preamble, and really perhaps really taking a look at also the duties of large property owners. Because the large property owners, as I've documented in my books, including my most recent book set, Turning the Page, a lot of the large property owners have throughout, really for almost a century, have lobbied for their own gravediggers. Whether National Socialist Germany, whether the Soviet Union, whether now Communist China, They have lobbied for the gravediggers of the United States, and irony of capitalism. The biggest capitalists are essentially, to paraphrase Lenin, have sold the rope that will be used to hang them. And that's a problem. We also see the effects of how much of Wall Street and corporate America, in many respects, how they've also pushed for policies that not only, of course, loosen export controls, so they allow to export high technology and valuable commodities to our foreign enemies, but they have also pushed against the New Deal programs, Great Society programs that have ameliorated the way of life and the living standards of Americans away from poverty towards people having the capability to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, if you will. You know, Head Start, Social Security, that allows elderly Americans to not die in poverty. Medicare, the same thing, it allows the elderly to have access to health care too as well. Head Start allows underprivileged youth to receive early childhood education. Labor unions, which has buttressed capitalism during its golden age from the period of World War II all the way until about until the Reagan era, that has buttressed capitalism. And unfortunately, big capital and Free Market Incorporated, which is funded by many elements within big capital and big finance, they've been chipping away with that, and they've launched a propaganda campaign against it, a very well-funded propaganda campaign, which took advantage of the economic downturn in the 1970s to insinuate themselves literally into power in the Reagan administration, even the last 2 years of Carter, but particularly starting under Reagan. And that has resulted largely in increased poverty, increased stress, the breakdown of the old nuclear family structure where dad can stay at home and mom, if she chooses to, or rather dad goes to work, has a full-time position that's relatively secure, and then mom, if she wanted to, she would stay home and she would take care of the affairs at home and raising the children. That was a healthy model that we had. People wanted to choose that. And I think that's a good thing. And that has really fell apart. We have more two-parent families that are working. That is a problem, in my opinion. That's not a good thing, because if the mother wanted to stay home, she couldn't, because they have to maintain a certain, basic middle-class lifestyle to ensure comfortable living and to ensure success for their children too, and just basic expenses. The corporate America, they push for a lot of these free trade deals, which lead to outsourcing and also importing foreign workers, which undercut American workers. So again, the large property owners are probably the worst class in the United States to have any influence on government. They really have failed the country. Their education policies of high-stakes testing has been a disaster. As a Floridian, I speak to that, essentially. It is true. Their trade policies have been a disaster. It has harmed our innovation, prosperity, and especially our national security. And their projects for deregulation and union busting has also impaired the shared but earned prosperity that we used to have. So a new constitution needs to address these issues, and we need to have potentially a new constitutional convention. Our concept of justice, or our judicial system, I should say, well, we have to take a look at our concept of justice. And to quote Judge Jackson back in the 1940s, who was, I believe, a justice or one of the justices in the Nuremberg War Tribunal, the Constitution, lastly, should not be a suicide pact. And that's where that comes into issues of internal security. And look, communists, fascists, people that I virulently disagree with, they should have the right to speak and publish their rhetoric and their viewpoints. But if these organizations or individuals have intimate ties with foreign powers, they need to be investigated. And if they're violating statutory law, they need to be potentially prosecuted. But at bare minimum, they need to be watched by the FBI. And there are organizations. There needs to be exposures of the true purposes of those organizations by Congress, by the House and Senate Intelligence subcommittees, to replace the House Un-American Activities Committee and the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, which were all abolished by the mid-1970s, which was, in my opinion, that was a mistake. But when it comes to banning organizations, the only time I would seriously consider that, or it should be considered in a new government, is if they have ties with governments that are plainly very adversarial towards the United States. Russia, China, Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea, and others, Iran, and others. Moving forward to economy. Where we stand on economics, we support as a starting point free enterprise, private property, competition, capitalism, if you want to call it. We do not consider ourselves socialists, and certainly not communists, and not fascists, and not national socialists or Nazis. Those systems, communism, national socialism, and fascism, are tyrannies by unaccountable governments. And that kind of tyranny, those types of tyrannies are extended into extreme forms of economic control, as well as political, social, and cultural controls, and massive human rights violations, genocide, crimes against humanity, et cetera, et cetera. But we also oppose libertarian, laissez-faire economics, uncontrolled corporate capitalism. We are basically for the economic model that used to exist starting in the 1930s up until about the late 1970s. We are for a system where you have strong non-Marxist labor unions balanced with management. We are for as much labor management harmony as possible, where there is justice for both the working man and woman, as well as the business person. Strong unions are very good, and they serve as countervailing power, to quote John Kenneth Galbraith, who's an economist, serves as a good countervailing power, countervailing force to that of the employer class. Unions should not be used as tools by extremist groups to undermine capitalism and free enterprise. The purpose is basically, to quote the former AFL-CIO leader, George Meany, is to basically negotiate with the capitalists in good faith on a decent share of the pie. Capitalists should get a big chunk of the pie, but also because, of course, capitalists, they tend to, for their management superiority in certain cases, them putting investments into a particular product and service, they do take a lot of risk. The old-fashioned type of capitalism, at least. Somebody opening up a business, a factory, a shop, a barber shop, a salon, they're putting their money in, they're basically taking a huge risk to try and make that business work. And they have to make sure that the books are balanced, that they get their customers and everything else. So business people or capitalists in the traditional sense, they are hardworking. They don't sit on their butts and twiddle their thumbs or sit poolside and drink wine. and just, go la, 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 la as the money gets deposited in their multiple bank accounts. That's not always how it works. And with labor is almost as critically important. This is where I disagree with this notion of job creators. Job creators are the consumers, the investors / capitalists or business owners, and the employees or workers. They all need each other. It's an organic whole. It's a functioning organism. It's not the capitalists or just the job creators and the workers. Well, they're just, job takers. That's nonsense. That's reactionary conservative crap. And that causes alienation of the working class because it's very much a sort of oligarchic kind of thinking, like, left over from the slave master days, like, I am the slave master and you need to be grateful to me. That's essentially what many of these right-wingers are basically saying when they say, we got to help the job creators and the job creators are wonderful and everything. No, I'm sorry. And plus, many of these so-called job creators have also exported jobs and have thrown people out of work because of downsizing and corporate downsizing, for better or for worse, as well as also importing foreign workers, foreign nationals, which undercuts the American worker. So labor is extremely important because the investor's shop or factory can't function without properly paid and properly motivated workers. It's just impossible. So they're a vital part of the puzzle of capitalism, of a functioning capitalist economy. You need these workers because the workers, there are more of us than capitalists. And that brings me to another point, which is these workers, these employees, white collar, blue collar, they're also consumers. And there are more of us than rich people. And you need the disposable income to pump the money in the economy, to buy their products, to consume their services in order to make the economy function. So labor is extremely important. Laborers are also your consumers. But we also can't ignore the risk and the investment and the hard work of a true independent capitalist. Now, this brings me to my next point. Excluded from this equation are elements within the finance capitalist community. And I'm not talking about traditional commercial banks that lend people money. I'm talking about the people that are derisively known as speculators. People that are just, all they do is just buy and sell. They're involved in derivatives and other complex financial instruments, which the Reagan administration, through their deregulation, as well as the Clinton administration, have really allowed to burst onto the economic scene so much that they are a very dominant force in our economy. That's very unhealthy because more often than not, these individuals are motivated by making money and massive profits, whatever the cost to national security, as well as our national sense of national prosperity. And that's very unhealthy for socio-cultural reasons, economic reasons, and national security and internal security reasons. So what I would do moving forward is, in the realm of economics, our starting point is free enterprise capitalism based on competition and private property. But there are deep flaws within unregulated corporate capitalism. And the way to solve these flaws is disincentivizing predatory forms of capitalism. And what we would have to do is reverse Reagan, Clinton, Bush, Trump deregulations on a case-by-case basis. And you have to take a look at the historical record. Stock buybacks. That was illegal up until 1982. Reagan and his Securities and Exchange Commission chairman, John Shad, deregulated that and gave stock buybacks what was termed safe harbor, meaning it was legalized. So companies, through various tax reforms, including the recent Trump tax reform, they would simply just, for the most part, buy their own stocks. They would not necessarily, they were not incentivized to invest in new plants in the United States, to pay higher wages for workers, et cetera, et cetera. To give you one example, things like stock buybacks need to be made illegal again, which it was before, and the economy functioned just fine. We need to restore Glass-Steagall, which created a firewall between commercial banking activities and investment activities. That needs to be restored. Regulation Q, the uptick rule, and other laws that were gotten rid of or watered down in the 1980s and 1990s. The Commodities Futures Modernization Act, which deregulated derivatives, that needs to be also thrown in the trash can. All of this deregulation has not helped. They have a bad historical track record. And I challenge you to go on your Google machine, your laptop computer, and look it up. It's all documented. It's all there. We need to get rid of right-to-work laws and establish the Second Bill of Rights of FDR, which guarantees, which we will put a plank, which guarantees collective bargaining and living wages. We will do that, particularly for medium and large-size employers that can actually afford that. We need to seriously take a look at that. And we definitely have to get rid of right to work. That should be banned by amendment in the Constitution. It has served no purpose. It has been a tool initially started by a racist political activist and business person, Vance Muse, look it up. And then the flame, and it was started, he was a Southern businessman. The Christian American Education Association was a virulent anti-Semite. He was a virulent anti-Black racist, and he supported this right to work because the Communist Party dominated Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, was organizing on a non-racial basis blacks and whites to fight for better working conditions in the South. And the Southern plantation slave free trade elite didn't like that. They didn't want that. And they used these reactionary policies to really hold the United States back through right to work. And I would get rid of right to work. And right to work, of course, then exploded on the scenes, the cause of various corporate globalists like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They picked up that cause in the early 1960s, and they fought for that along with the Conservative Incorporated, starting really in the, I guess in the 70s and 80s is when the anti-union organizing continued to gain steam. And of course, under the Tea Party wave in the early 2010s, you had the expansion of right to work. And that has resulted in decreases in living standards of the American workers, less paid by a couple of $1,000s per year compared to workers who live in unionized states. The list goes on and on and on. So conceptually speaking, I'm very pro-union. Doesn't mean unions are perfect or they always do the right thing, but the institution of unions over the overall economic benefit for American workers, American employees has been wholly beneficial. When this country saw in the private sector at its height in the 1950s, 35% of American workers were unionized, and that had a positive ripple effect throughout the United States. So we need to get rid of right to work. We need to take a look, have a commission for the de-Reaganization of the economy. And we need to look on a case-by-case basis of reversing a lot of the deregulation that occurred under Reagan and Clinton and George W. Bush and even Trump. We need to also have a tax system an immigration policy. We need to have a tax policy, an immigration policy, and a trade policy that's based on a healthy and rational civic nationalism that incentivizes production, industrial production, agricultural production, and mining, as well as research and development. It needs to incentivize those sectors at the expense of financial speculation. So that's going to be another thing that patriotic populists support, essentially. And that's going to require taking a look at treaties, pulling out of NAFTA, and really revising the new U.S. Mexico-Canada trade agreement. We need to take a look at the South Korea, Panama, and Colombia free trade agreements. We need to take a look, as I said, for the USMCA, which was formerly NAFTA. We need to take a look at our massive trade imbalances with Japan. And we also have to take a look and really wean ourselves off very slowly with a strategic plan to really wean ourselves off of over-reliance on raw materials as well as manufactured goods from the Russian Federation under Vladimir Putin and communist China, and Vietnam, governed also by communists. These are countries that we should not be exporting high technology items to. We should not be dependent on critical materials and large amounts of consumer goods as well on those countries. And we should not be exporting high technology and even weapon systems to those countries, or dual use technologies to be used in weapon systems, machine tools, computers, etc. This is something that's going to take a lot of time, and it's going to take quite a bit of strategic maneuvering. But this is something that in a new patriotic populist government, in a left-right consensus, in an ideal world, we need to sit down and we need to make this happen because it's a matter of national survival. With the Export-Import Bank, we are for the Export-Import Bank. We want to encourage exports to free countries, to neutral countries, to allies, but we also do not want to use the subsidies for the Export-Import Bank to subsidize exports to Russia and China, for example. And that has happened in the past. That needs to be stopped. To reverse outsourcing, what we would do in a 5-year period is, as a new federal government, we would allow corporations that have operations abroad that then manufacture or process and export their goods back to the United American market. What we would do is give them 5 years to repatriate their operations back in the United States. And if need be, we would give them very generous tax incentives and write-offs. But if they don't, they will be faced with a 100% tariff on those goods re-exported back into the American market. We would slowly take a look at getting rid of most of the work visa programs. We would take a look at getting rid of or limiting tremendously the H-1B visa programs. We have plenty of computer programmers. In fact, you hear the stories of how American companies fire their American workers, and then they import foreign workers, foreign nationals, to take over those jobs, often at lower wage rates. That is wrong. That needs to be forbidden, as a matter of fact. There's no excuse not to have enough trained people, and that calls for long-term federal investments in higher education. We're going to talk about that later. And we also we really need to take a look at really over a 5-year period abolishing the H-1B visa program, or at least severely limiting where we would pay the foreign workers, if we need them so badly and if they're so great, pay them the same wage as their American counterparts. I put that test out there to American companies. Don't exploit foreigners who simply want to better their own lives and better their family lives. Don't exploit them and use them as disposable commodities and exploit them by underpaying them. As with the lower skilled workers in the H-2 program, visa program, for example, work visa program, for example, what I would do is I would also pay them the same wages as their American counterparts, as long as it was impossible to recruit Americans. And the way to recruit American workers is simply pay them more. In fact, John McCain infamously said, the former senator from Arizona stated one time years ago, that even if you paid Americans like $50 to pick tomatoes, they're still not going to take the jobs. And apparently what happened is that a lot of people were calling his office saying, where are those jobs? Where are those jobs? I'll pick tomatoes for $50 an hour. I mean, heck, I probably would do that too on a day off. I mean, geez, write me, tell me where those jobs are. So the bottom line is Americans can be recruited for those positions if you pay them a decent wage. You could also choose to mechanize the picking of fruit and the picking of vegetables, crops, if you can't find enough American workers even to be willing to work for a decent salary. So that's my position on the work visa programs. Infrastructure is an important part of the economy. We are 100% for New Deal, WTPA, and PWA type of programs. We would take a look at expanding access to rural broadband, internet broadband services. We would take a look at dredging waterways that have been neglected, particularly in parts of the New York, New Jersey area, to take an example, and keeping them maintained. I would take that burden off of businesses too, because starting under Ronald Reagan, you had a change in the policy of the Water Resources Act. And what had happened is that businesses, even independent businesses, were forced to take on partially the costs of dredging operations. And that was another expense that various small and medium-sized independent businesses had difficulty meeting. That is something we're going to get rid of. We're going to get rid of, again, that garbage Reagan policy. And the federal government, once again, through the Army Corps of Engineers, is going to have the full financial responsibility to dredge the waterways. And dredging the waterways will get more trucks off of the road. It would allow cheaper transportation of finished goods as well as raw materials to various terminals and factories in the United States. So that is something that really has to be undertaken immediately. We would continue rail and highway improvements to our airports. That is something that the federal governments and state and local governments would definitely cooperate in unified efforts to improve those forms of infrastructure. We would definitely expand the access to rural health clinics and rural hospitals, so our rural populations are healthy. And then moving into education, that's also, of course, part of infrastructure too. And that is something that we will definitely invest in as well. We will also take a look at high-speed rail. We would consider transforming sections of Amtrak when appropriate, depending on number of customers and demand for service. We would take a look at converting certain parts of the Amtrak railroad system into high-speed rail. We would also take a look at renewing the program for supersonic transports, and that was done as late or as far back, I should say, as the early 1970s or sometime during the 1970s, but that was dropped. We would take a look at the feasibility for that. I mean, the British have that with the Concorde, so why can't the United States have that? So we would take a look at the environmental effects, and we would take a look at the economic rationale for that as well. We would also take a look at not only renewing and continuing to modernize passenger railroads, but also freight railroad systems. Very, very important. Takes more and more trucks off the road. When it comes to education, with education, what we would simply do, oh, not simply, there's many multifaceted aspects to education. Number one, we would invest in public schools primarily in ensuring that, yes, teachers are well paid and well compensated, that they don't have to take all these side jobs in order for them to economically survive. That is absolutely wrong. Okay, I'm going to put it out there. Other professions use salaries and benefits as a means of recruiting the best talent. Why can't you do that with teachers? Down here in Florida, teachers are generally paid a pittance to what they're actually worth, at least as a profession. That needs to change. Seriously, you have teachers leaving the red states to teach elsewhere. Florida is an example. West Virginia is another example. They're fleeing. They're leaving. Why? Because they can't survive on the salaries that are paid. And they're also blamed for the students' failures. They're also spend a lot of time on preparing students for standardized tests that are administered by the state. These are problems that educators need to be faced. And patriotic populists are pro-teacher. We understand what you're going through. To the, quote, good teacher who spends time at home grading papers, preparing for lessons, calling parents, the majority of teachers do that. I know them personally. They have to teach 20 to 30 kids in a classroom, or up to that number. That's no easy task. You have to teach them the curriculum. You have to manage them, manage their behavior. I mean, in certain respects, the teacher spends more time with the child than the parent does. So I think policymakers, they really need to see the reality of education through the eyes of the teacher, even the student in certain ways, and the parents. And there needs to be balancing of concerns and the needs of the teachers and the other educational personnel, the students and the parents, and also the community too, the community as a whole. We need to stress life skills in education. Yes, it's important to give a general math, science, and social science, meaning social studies, curriculum, English, and literature, grammar, punctuation, sentence structure, all that's important. But starting under Reagan and Bush, you had the chipping away of things that dealt with life skills, art, civic education. I document this in my book, Turning the Page, which describes and documents my journey and why I moved away from conservatism to patriotic populism, or as I termed it, radical civic nationalism. This is what's going on. We need to have investments and a refocusing of our curriculum, not only in the reading, writing, and arithmetic, which is all important to a degree, but we also need to take a look at re-implementing programs related to the arts, physical education every day, kids exercising, to encourage them to get them into healthy lifestyles. We need to be serving nutritious but tasty foods in the cafeterias. There needs to be a slow shift in our culture in diet and exercise, and we can start that slowly but surely through informational campaigns at the schools. We need to take a look at the reimplementation of life skills, like how to balance a checkbook, basic financial terminology, what is a CD, how does a credit card work, how do you open and maintain a bank account, basic information on enterprise and business and entrepreneurship, basics. Shop, basic carpentry, life skills, how to sew an article of clothing, I guess, cooking, just very basic stuff. Because there's no guarantee that their parents are around. We're talking in planet reality, not what it should be, but planet reality of society out there. And that is not every parent is going to be around or is even equipped to teach their children this for a variety of reasons. It's not a bad thing or a good thing. It's just a reality. So you have to make the decision. Do you want these people to fall through the cracks? Or do you want to take measures to ameliorate the situation? It's all based on willpower. Willpower of the leadership and an accepting by society, a move away from extreme individualism that man is just an island and we're all in it for ourselves. And instead, as I talked about in the first show with Herschel, the first episode of the Patriotic Populist, we have to move culturally away from this sort of unbridled extreme forms of individualism to a healthy balance of individualism as well as a sense that we're all in this together, a sense of national community, which cuts across gender, sexual orientation, race, and class. We're all in it together. We're all individuals, but as far as aspects of economy and political systems goes, we're also in this together, or otherwise the nation will progressively decline and then potentially collapse or fall. Lastly, with education, we need to also take a look at civic education. And that means the children need to be taught about different forms of government, our history, critical thinking, problem-solving skills, which extends into other subject areas, as well as also the enemies of free society. What is communism? What is Nazism about? What is fascism about? What are their theories? Put in very basic terms, because we're dealing with, we're dealing with, K through 12, and really a lot of this is going to, my suggestions are applying for mainly high school, grades 9 through 12. So I would take a look at that. At civic education. That's something that I would prioritize as well, along with life skills, shop, and also, of course, reading, writing, arithmetic in its basic sense needs to be continued. When it comes to college and universities, not everybody is equipped to go to college. I'm sorry, that's just the fact. That's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing. It's just, it is what it is. So what we need to do in college is, several things. Number one, we need to transition. In order to reindustrialize the United States, one of the things we need to do is invest in our human capital. People that are skilled or have certain predispositions or talents related to science, invention, engineering, and medicine. And those majors need to be tuition-free for the students. Meaning that students who want to graduate as doctors, as engineers, as biologists, as chemists, and other majors, physics, and other majors that are useful for the increase in the manufacturing sector, that needs to be subsidized. It needs to be, quote, free college tuition for that. because that's going to ultimately build up the industrial base, because we are nurturing, once again, our human talent that can innovate and develop new products that can be manufactured. That's the first thing with college education. The other thing I would like to do is I would like to continue to have, obviously, the vocational programs, but I would also increase public funding, taxpayer-supported funding for that too as well. Because vocational professions, for example, like welding, is very important in the manufacturing sector. You know, learning how to operate lathes, machine tools, other things. That type of education, vocational technical education, is very important and critical for the reindustrialization of the United States, because at one of perhaps the biggest core, the core of reindustrialization efforts starts with the people, amongst other things, but especially the people, the talent, the people that will know how to operate the machines, that will know how to solve problems in factories. If there's a problem with production in the line, problem solving is essential. You need that technical expertise. It needs to be nurtured. Many vocational programs also allow people to develop their own businesses. And that's good, because one of the areas in economy that we would like to see is the proliferation of small businesses. And that comes through low cost, small tuition rates, or subsidized, meaning taxpayer funded fully, vocational technical education. Get that, my handy dandy Pinot Noir wine. Very good. And people are going to say, well, you know, you're for socialism or the welfare state, and that's not in the Constitution. And they're going to bellyache about all these, really, in my opinion, non-arguments, because they don't address the actual merits based on the results of these policies. I mean, on the state level and local level, states like New York and California had free college in the state universities and municipal universities at the municipal level. Country didn't move to Stalinism. It's not like we threw the Constitution away and we had this police state. So if you say, oh, you're going to move slippery slope to fascism because you're increasing state involvement, I mean, can it, spare it? It didn't happen in the past. It's not going to happen in the future. So just stop when you say those arguments, because I got limited to no patience for that. I used to believe in that until I saw the reality unfold, did the research, and looked at the world around me and interacted with the world at large. Okay? Which also, one point about economy, one thing, because we're talking about small businesses. I mean, economy is such a complicated issue. We would also need to declare a moratorium on mergers and acquisitions. That was something that Reagan liberalized, and every other president really did not pay any heed to it. We had this idea, former Justice Robert Bork, the Law and Property Movement, and others. Milton Friedman had talked about this, saying that private monopoly is generally not can be a good thing and is generally not a bad thing, because private monopolies tend to be more efficient than state-owned monopolies, and as long as it results in lower consumer prices, then companies should be able to merge with each other. Well, in reality, that's not necessarily true, because large monopolies, it's not a government issue. It's not like the federal government is, at fault for this. In fact, it's federal inaction in allowing mergers that have harmed free enterprise. So don't listen to these libertarians and these conservative incorporated types that says, oh, it's big government. Please, that's a lie. They're lying to you, or they're individuals blinded by free market fundamentalist ideology. Before the Reagan era, we had a massive amount of small businesses competing against each other. But over time, the number of self-employed individuals and small businesses have slowly crept downwards. You know, the old mom and pop stores that were pillars of the community that everybody could go to. You had your house charges with them that you could pay back, and you knew the local business owners. That's over time has been slowly squeezed out. A lot of independent lumber yards, for example, declined tremendously as a result of the proliferation of Lowe's and Home Depot, which incidentally are not the most enlightened employers. I know a good friend of mine was employed by Lowe's. He's told me a lot of stories about basically employee exploitation and mistreatment. So in reality, monopolization as a result of mergers and acquisitions is not necessarily a good thing. And just do the research. I also talk about it in my book, Turning the Page, Volume 2. I talk about the effects of Reaganism and deregulation and the explosion of mergers, corporate mergers. And I talk a little bit about it in the first chapter of my book, or the first chapter of Volume 1 of Turning the Page. So moving forward, we covered quite a bit on the economy. We talked about economy, education. We talked about political reform. I'm going to end this stream, and then I'm going to do part 2 of where we stand on the issues. Thank you.